Hi everybody, and welcome to the Modern Stoicism YouTube channel. Can everyone just type hello in the live chat area to confirm that you can all see me and hear me okay? My dog Mookie's here, by the way. She might just bark or wander into shot to say hello. My name is Donald Robertson, and I'm speaking to you from Nova Scotia today. Where is everyone else from? Post your comments in the live chat right now. There's a delay of about 30 seconds or so before you'll see my responses, but I'll try to read your live chat throughout and just check in, see if you have any questions. As you type in questions, I'll come back to them probably later on in the presentation today. But begin thinking of any questions you have and just put them in the chat so that I can read them and come back to them later. Cool. Looks like you guys can hear me okay. So we will begin, and more people are starting to appear now. Okay, so I should begin by introducing myself properly. My name is Donald Robertson, and I'm a cognitive behavioural psychotherapist from Scotland in the UK. But a number of years ago I emigrated to Canada, so I live in Nova Scotia now. I've written 5 books on philosophy and psychotherapy, and I'm also one of the members of the Modern Stoicism team. And we're responsible for Stoicon, Stoicon X, the Stoicism Today blog, which is edited by Greg Sadler, Stoic Week, and the Stoic Mindfulness and Resilience Training, or SMRT course, which I run, and that's beginning very soon on the 16th of July, so a little bit of a plug for that. If anybody wants a link for that, let me know and I'll just post it in the comments later. If you want information about any of those things, I'm not going to talk a lot about them because I discussed them in the last YouTube Live webinar that I did. But if you want to find out more, just go to our website, which is modernstoicism.com. So it's just modernstoicism, all one word, .com, and you'll find out about all of those things there. So, I see more of you saying hi from Pittsburgh. Sight and sound is okay, good to know. From Brisbane, where there's a Stoicon X event. Atlanta, Birmingham, Alabama, cool. Okay, hi everybody. Okay, so psychological exercises in Stoicism. I said I'd cut to the chase today and do a kind of deep dive in that subject. This is my specialist area of expertise, I suppose, because I have a background in academic philosophy, and also I'm a cognitive behavioural therapist, and I'm a kind of techniques guy in therapy. I was very interested for many years in understanding the full repertoire or armamentarium of psychological techniques that are available to jobbing therapists. So hopefully we'll be able to say some interesting things about that. And just a little bit of housekeeping before we begin. First of all, I should say how long. We're probably going to go on for about half an hour. I think I said that last time and it went on for nearly an hour, but I'll aim to keep things a little bit more concise today. This is still a pilot of webinars that we're planning to do for SMRT, and today I'm trying out new encoding software and a new camera today. It's a Logitech C920 for geeks out there. So just let me know if you think the audio and video are okay and the lighting's okay and stuff like that, because I believe in co-creation, and if you guys give us feedback, it helps us to improve the webinars that we do in the future for people that are on SMRT and other courses. Okay, so let's say a little bit about the subject today, the psychological exercises that are in Stoicism. There are lots of them. When I first got interested in Stoicism, people told me that they didn't really see that there was a systematic approach underlying things like the meditations of Marcus Aurelius, or that there were really things comparable to modern psychotherapy. People actually believed that. And when I said I was writing a book about it, they told me that they thought I was kind of stretching things or whatever. And now it seems to be received wisdom, or it's just kind of taken for granted that Stoicism has this repertoire of psychological techniques, because they're definitely there. And there are many, many references to them. And in other branches of ancient philosophy, particularly in the Hellenistic era, all the schools of philosophy had some of these techniques, but Stoicism in particular had a repertoire of psychological techniques. And the ancient schools of philosophy all of them, most of them, going back to Socrates, maybe beyond, employed many kind of typical metaphors to describe what they meant by philosophy. And what they meant by philosophy is different from what we think of as philosophy today. We think of it as something today that you do in a university seminar room or in a library. It's kind of more of a bookish subject. But ancient Greek and Roman philosophy, generally speaking, was more of a way of life, like a Western yoga or Western Buddhism. Sometimes that's how people like to describe it. And there were practices involved in that. Some philosophical schools, like the Cynics in particular, were very unbookish or unacademic, and they were much more interested in developing endurance and self-discipline and virtue and so on. So there always was this practical dimension, and one of the metaphors that they used was athletic training, military training, but also medicine was always a metaphor that ancient philosophers used, that philosophy was a kind of medicine for the soul, which is what we mean today by psychotherapy. Although modern psychotherapy in many ways is very different from what the ancient philosophers were doing, there are many parallels. So some of the techniques, I should say before I begin that I first became interested in the subject because I read these books by Pierre Hadot, who's a French academic. I read Hadot's writings on Plotinus first and Neoplatonism, and then I got into his books about Hellenistic philosophy and Stoicism, and there's another one here by him, that was Philosophy as a Way of Life. This is what is ancient philosophy, again, because ancient philosophy is very different from modern philosophy. It is, as his other book title says, a way of life. And after having read Hadot's books, this is Hadot's book about Marcus Aurelius' Meditations, which is, I think even many non-academics really love this book. It's one of the best books on Stoicism. It's called The Inner Citadel. It's just an analysis of the meditations and commentary on it. It goes into a lot of detail. And I saw immediately that Hadot was describing this repertoire of what he called spiritual exercises, or contemplative techniques, meditative techniques. He understood it more in terms of the theological tradition. And I was a psychotherapist at the time, and I thought these spiritual exercises all resemble techniques that we use, or most of them resemble techniques that we use in modern psychotherapy. And so I wrote this book, or I was asked actually to write this book by the publisher, Karnak. It's called The Philosophy of Cognitive Behavioural Therapy, Stoic Philosophy as Rational and Cognitive Psychotherapy. And this was my attempt to take the techniques that Hadot identified and compare the concepts and techniques of Stoicism to ones that are found in modern evidence-based psychotherapy. And in short, the form of psychotherapy that most obviously resembles ancient philosophy is cognitive behavioural therapy. And actually, even within that particular forms of cognitive behavioural therapy, because it's quite a diverse tradition, and the form of Hellenistic philosophy that most resembles modern psychotherapy is Stoicism, which is one of my reasons for being interested in it. Hey, dog. Amazing what you can do with doggy treats. Yeah. Shh, calm down. Yeah. So, where was I before I was so rudely interrupted? Oh yeah, CBT and Stoicism. Beck and Ellis, the two main founders of CBT, both said that Stoicism was the original philosophical inspiration for cognitive therapy. In fact, Beck says that in Cognitive Therapy for Depression, which was the first major treatment manual published in 1979. But Albert Ellis, who developed a thing called Rational Emotive Behaviour Therapy, or REBT, mainly in the 1960s, which is the first kind of major form of CBT, or first major precursor of CBT, depending how you look at it. Ellis had originally read Marcus Aurelius, and to some extent, I think, Epictetus, and he had been a psychoanalyst and then got fed up and disillusioned with that and decided to develop his own approach to psychotherapy that was more rational, and he drew on his reading of Stoicism to inspire him in that direction. So modern therapy, it's not a coincidence, it was inspired by and influenced by Stoicism. And also, they happen to share a fundamental theoretical premise or assumption in common, which is the cognitive theory of emotion. So the belief that our thoughts and beliefs fundamentally determine our emotions. And that's not, as someone was saying to me the other day, supposed to be reductionist. It's not the idea that those are the only things that determine emotions, but the cognitive therapists introduced the idea or emphasised the idea that cognition was a major factor and could be an important point of leverage in psychotherapy to help us to control our emotions. So that's how cognitive behavioural therapy developed, and it shares that assumption basically with Stoicism. So it's not surprising that given that fundamental shared assumption, Stoicism and CBT end up arriving at a lot of similar conclusions about what kind of techniques might be beneficial. So just to kind of dive right in, again, for those of you, I think a few more people have joined us. If you're a latecomer, a straggler, if you want to just say a little bit about what part of the world you're from, I'm speaking from Nova Scotia. And also, if you have any questions, if you want to start just kind of firing those into the live chat, I'll come back and have a look at those a little bit later and see if I can answer some of them. But I wanted to begin by saying something about Marcus Aurelius. So just to make sure I give you a kind of real, get into the guts of the subject, there is a passage in Marcus Aurelius where he summarizes in a beautiful way. He goes through and summarizes 10 different strategies, 10 different cognitive strategies, as we might say today, for dealing with anger. So, Stoicism has quite a lot of anger management techniques, has quite a lot of techniques for coping with pain, for coping with anxiety. So there are areas where Stoicism is obviously relevant to particular problems. And sometimes it's interesting to approach it from that point of view. So this is what Marcus says about anger. And again, for any latecomers, because people always question this, we're not saying that Stoicism is reducible to a form of psychotherapy, but that Stoicism contains therapeutic concepts, that modern psychotherapy was influenced by it. But Stoicism itself is a philosophy. It's much bigger than simply a psychological therapy. And that's part of the appeal of it. So what does Marcus actually say? This is in book 11, towards the end of the Meditations, and it's section 18. And he says, when he's writing to himself, and he says, when I'm offended by the actions of others, when I'm taking offence, I'm getting angry, here are 9 pieces of advice, and he compares them to the 9 muses. And number 1 is, remember the close bond between yourself and the rest of mankind, that we all came into the world for the sake of one another. And he appeals to this idea of Stoic cosmopolitanism, basically. And he starts to think about the purpose of human life being partly collaboration and to help each other. That's what his philosophy tells him. Those are his values. And viewing things in that way helps him to be more forgiving, more accepting towards other people. Incidentally, from the histories, we know that Marcus Aurelius had a reputation for being a particularly forgiving emperor. He was a gentle spirit, if you like. He had a reputation for clemency. So the first one is, remember the close bond between yourself and the rest of mankind. The second one, he says, think of the characters of those who offend you, how they are at the table, in their beds and so on, and remember the effect that their negative way of acting and thinking has on them and the misplaced confidence it gives them. So in other words, view them as vulnerable, like see them as being flawed, ignorant, misguided, and Marcus is suggesting that when we think about their life in this rounded way, and view them as people who have their own struggles, who have misplaced confidence, have problems as a result of their attitudes, it helps us to develop a certain level of detachment, perhaps. Number 3, if what they're doing is right, you've no reason to complain, and if it's not right, then it must have been done involuntarily and unintentionally, because everybody wants to be right everybody desires to perceive things truthfully and accurately. And he's referring here to a concept that goes all the way back to Socrates, which is that nobody deliberately denies the truth. Nobody deliberately, generally speaking, wants to be wrong about things. And so if they are wrong, then it's unintentional. Whereas if they're right, then you should listen to what they're saying, which is, that's a theme that we find in many Stoic passages, actually. Number 4, you yourself are no different from them, and you upset people in various ways. So, basically, this is in therapy we talk about undoing projection. Maybe you're doing some of the things that you're angry with them for. The Stoics were renowned for not putting their founders on pedestals. They believed that everybody was flawed. The sage was kind of an ideal. They didn't have any gurus. Even the founders of Stoicism weren't considered to be perfectly wise. So if you look at the Stoic literature, it's obvious that they all dwell on this idea of accepting their own fallibility. But then if we accept our own fallibility, we should be less judgmental about other people. Number 5, remember you've got no guarantee they're doing the wrong thing anyway. People's motives aren't always what they seem, and there's usually a lot to learn before any surefire moral judgments can be made about other people's actions. In therapy, we talk about mind reading as a thinking error, cognitive distortion. So we should suspend judgment a little bit because we can't be sure for certain what's going on in other people's minds. And when we're angry with them, we're kind of jumping to conclusions about what their intentions are in many cases. Number 6, tell yourself that when you feel upset and fed up, that human life is transient and only lasts a moment. It won't be long before we've all been laid to rest. This is an idea that Marcus repeats in other places, that when he's upset with people, he should just think about the transience of human life. And the idea in Stoicism is that when we see things as transient and not lasting, that one day it'll all be gone and forgotten, we kind of become less emotionally attached to it. Number 7, get rid of this. Make a decision to quit thinking of things as insulting, and your anger immediately disappears. How do you get rid of that? By realising that you've not really been harmed by their actions. Again, this is a theme that recurs all the way through the Stoic literature. It's similar to the famous slogan of Epictetus, which is taught to the majority of clients at the beginning during the socialisation phase of cognitive therapy. There's a quote from the handbook of Epictetus that says, "It's not things that upset us, but our judgments about things." And Marcus is kind of alluding to this concept here, that when we realise that the harm comes from our own value judgments rather than the thing itself, we don't have to be angry unless we make the value judgment that we've been wronged. But then if we really believe that virtue is the only true good, then other people's actions could never really harm us. This theme recurs a lot in Stoicism, and that should neutralise anger. Number 8, anger and frustration hurt us more than the things that we're annoyed about do. So there's a kind of irony there, or a paradox. Seeing how toxic anger and frustration are. Seneca describes anger as a kind of temporary madness. It's one of the Stoic passions. And so, Marcus is saying another remedy for it is just realising how toxic anger is and how counterproductive it really is. Number 9, kindness is an irresistible force, as long as it's genuine and without any fake smiles or two-facedness. And he talks about how, generally speaking, as long as we persevere with being kind and forgiving towards other people, like they'll often change in response to us. That might be a controversial idea, but I believe there's a lot of truth in it, actually. And then the 10th piece of advice that he gives, he says it's from Apollo himself, the head of the Muses. To expect bad men never to do bad things is just madness. It's asking the impossible. This is a recurring theme in Stoicism, and I'm going to come back to it as well. It's linked to Stoic determinism. The idea that the Stoic wise man should never really be surprised by anything. And it's kind of fake naivety to be surprised at certain things. Seneca, when he was executed by Nero, even said to his friends, of course we should have expected this to happen. Nero is a tyrant. Like, and a murderer, should I be surprised when he sends men to murder me? So the Stoic, if he's a wise man, if he thinks about things philosophically and rationally, that should take away a lot of the element of surprise about things in life, to expect bad. There are necessarily good people and bad people in the world. Given that there are bad people, to expect them not to do bad things would be foolish and naive. So looking at things in this very cold, logical, deterministic kind of way, Marcus is suggesting is another possible remedy for anger. So I'm just having a quick glance at the time. We've got about 10 minutes to go, so I'm going to just give you an overview of some of the other techniques and strategies that we find in Stoicism. Let's have a look at the comments. Told a lot about negative visualization. Yeah, sure. I'm going to come back to that, answer some of those questions at the end. Keep typing them in, and then I'll do a little 5-minute Q&A sort of response at the end. Okay, so some of the other things that we find in the Stoic literature, there are lots of techniques. I've got a list of about 20 here, so I'm probably just going to pick out a handful of them. One of the main ones is just contemplating virtue in general and really asking ourselves, what does it mean to be wise? What does it mean to excel? What are our core values in life? And that resembles a technique in modern therapy called ValuesClarification, which has been around since the 70s, but at the moment it's part of one of the main evidence-based treatments for clinical depression. So there's some evidence to suggest that approach is particularly effective for depressed clients and maybe for clients with other types of condition as well, possibly generalized anxiety disorder. Related to that perhaps is the Stoic idea of contemplation of the sage. So trying to imagine what a perfect wise man would do, what his attitudes would be, what would a wise man say to himself, what would he think in terms of challenging situations. That's a bit like saying what would Jesus do or what would Muhammad do. I think at one point Epictetus actually says to his students, ask yourself what Socrates or Diogenes would do in this situation. Maybe not Diogenes, but so he mentions Socrates. He holds Diogenes up as a big role model as well. So modern therapy, we call that role modelling. Contemplating the virtues of other people is something that the Stoics seem to do a lot. The first chapter of the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius is just this huge survey of all the virtues of his teachers, his family, mainly his philosophy tutors and his close family, also his rhetoric tutor Fronto. And doing that serves many purposes. If we really spend time contemplating the strengths of character that other people have, it's easier for us to emulate them, and it also changes our relationship with other people, allows us to appreciate them more. Picturing the consequences of our actions is another strategy that the Stoics talk about, and specifically asking, how will this affect me? Will it contribute towards eudaimonia? Like, will it contribute to virtue, or is it just going to be counterproductive and harmful in the long term? That's similar to what we call functional analysis in therapy. Obviously, getting people to think about the consequences of their actions in a rational way, in a patient, calm way, is a very beneficial thing. Sometimes we call it cost-benefit analysis in cognitive therapy, or weighing up the pros and cons of our actions. Living in accord with virtue throughout the day, just checking, are we acting in a way that's self-disciplined, wise? Are we doing the things that we praise and admire in other people? The Stoics were very interested in this idea that people have a double standard, that we praise and admire certain virtues in other people but don't necessarily embrace them ourselves. And this idea of identifying those things through value clarification and then actually trying to live more like the people we admire, it's similar to a process, again, that's often used in treatment for clinical depression today, which is called activity scheduling. I should say another really fundamental technique in Stoicism, in fact the one that the handbook of Epictetus opens with, is contemplating the dichotomy of control, or what I like to call the Stoic fork. Some things are up to us and other things are not. This is probably the main theme that runs throughout the discourses of Epictetus. If I remember rightly, it's actually not only the first sentence of the handbook, it's the topic of the first of his discourses, if I recall that correctly. But it's not so much a concept that's emphasised in CBT, but not incompatible with CBT. And then there are a bunch of things that kind of relate more to Stoic physics. One would be a technique that Pierre Hadot calls the view from above, where we picture things, as Marcus describes it, as if from a high watchtower. Well, the obvious analogy here is like the gods atop Mount Olympus looking down on the earth. So this kind of elevated perspective helps the Stoics to retain equanimity. Just in passing, I'd say about that there's a ton of research today that shows that when people are anxious and distressed, they typically narrow down the scope of their attention. And so things that allow us to broaden the scope of our attention potentially have a diluting effect on strong negative emotions. Contemplating cosmology is part of that or related to it. Sometimes not only looking down on things as if from high up in Mount Olympus, but actually thinking about the vastness of time and space, the totality of things. So basically just thinking about cosmology is a kind of related technique. I think this is a tremendously important aspect of Stoicism, and I can only really mention it today, but there are many, many other techniques that seem to me to be derivative of that or to be related to it. It's a kind of very much a cornerstone of Stoic physics that's trying to grasp the totality of things. And then another aspect of Stoic physics is trying to achieve an objective representation of things by suspending rhetoric and value judgments, viewing things in a very down-to-earth, matter-of-fact way. And the Stoics think of this as a particularly good way of coping with pain by dissecting our sensations and viewing them almost like with scientific detachment, as we would say today, or to them, viewing them with the detachment of a natural philosopher, taking the emotion out of it, like viewing things in a matter-of-fact way. Linked to that, contemplating the transience of all things. That's a big recurring theme in the Stoic literature. In poetry, where it's also a big theme in Latin poetry, we refer to it as a trope called ubi sunt, which means where are they now? And Marcus kind of does this all the time. Where are they now? Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great, Pompey. They're food for worms. They're just dust. Alexander's no better than his mule driver or servant or something. Like they all end up as bones. Where are they now? Thinking about the transience of things in that way. And that's related to the idea also of contemplating our own death, which is a big theme in early 20th century existentialist literature, particularly Heidegger. But it comes from classical philosophy. In Socratic philosophy, in Platonism, it's called Militate Honor, the contemplation of death. And this is obviously a well-known aspect of Stoicism. It used to be in the 19th century a big theme in art as well, the memento mori tradition in art, and until recently many clocks and watches were engraved with Latin sayings like hora fugit, the hour flies, or tempus fugit, time flies, reminding us about the transience of things. Contemplating determinism, I've kind of touched on already. Some people are kind of against determinism, but it's not a big part of modern therapy. But there was an early 20th century rational psychotherapist called Paul Dubois, a Swiss psychotherapist, who was very much influenced by Seneca. Albert Ellis more influenced by Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius. Dubois really into Seneca, gave Seneca copies of Seneca to his clients to read, and he was particularly drawn to the concept of Stoic determinism because he thought it had immense therapeutic potential. He thought people would learn more empathy towards others, more forgiveness for themselves if they were viewed things in a more matter-of-fact and deterministic way. And this is tied into the idea in Stoicism that the sage shouldn't really be surprised by things. Like Marcus, it's crazy to think that bad men won't ever do bad things. Stoic acceptance also takes many forms, just radical acceptance of things that are happening to us. That doesn't mean not trying to change them, but it means accepting the reality of them. This is a major theme in modern psychotherapy as well. We call the third wave of modern psychotherapy mindfulness and acceptance-based therapy. Premeditatio malorum, or the premeditation of adversity, what Irving calls negative visualization. In therapy we call that imaginal exposure or decatastrophizing. It's particularly used with generalized anxiety disorder, social phobia, simple phobias, specific phobias. And it basically involves closing your eyes and visualizing distressing events as if they're happening now. It is one of the most robustly supported techniques in the entire field of modern psychotherapy research, incidentally. But it has to be done properly. If it's done wrongly, it can backfire and be counterproductive. So that's why I think sometimes it's useful when we're talking about Stoic exercises to look at what modern psychology actually tells us about do's and don'ts. The reserve clause in Stoicism, when we undertake any action, we should always do it while simultaneously accepting that we might be thwarted because the outcome isn't completely under our control. It's a major theme in the Stoic philosophy of action. Mindfulness, the Stoics call prosoche, paying attention to your own faculty of judgment. Focusing on the present moment, the here and now, is a central theme, particularly in Marcus Aurelius. There's a technique that occurs particularly in Epictetus that would today be called cognitive distancing, that's related to mindfulness, and I think it's particularly important, but it's not very well understood because it's a slippery concept. It's well known to modern psychologists. It's very important in modern therapy, but many classicists and philosophers would be unfamiliar with it as a concept, so they don't really identify it or talk about it much, but it is very clearly described in Epictetus. For instance, where he says when a troubling impression occurs, you should tell yourself you're just an impression and not at all the things that you claim to represent. So it's seeing thoughts as thoughts and not kind of conflating them with reality. It's a tricky concept for many people, but it seems to be a very powerful therapeutic technique. Not many people mention the fact that the Stoics, particularly Epictetus, also talk about postponement as a psychological strategy. Postponement is central to modern techniques for treating generalized anxiety disorder, which is kind of the worry disorder. And again, it can be done, if it's done badly, this can be very counterproductive. There are do's and don'ts to it. But when worry postponement is done properly, it's one of the simplest and most effective techniques in the field of cognitive therapy. So it usually follows on from doing some cognitive distancing, so getting a kind of detachment from our thoughts, not trying to avoid them, but just not allowing ourselves to be swept along with them, and saying, I'm going to set this aside, I'm going to come back to it later, once my feelings have naturally abated. Giving it some time, taking a time out is how that's sometimes described in anger management. We've kind of gone on for half an hour. I'm just going to begin to wrap up. I guess we'll go on for maybe another 5 or 10 minutes and just conclude, because I want to give you a full overview. There are many writing techniques in Stoicism. There are many individual sayings. I have a blog article where I go through and list all the things that Epictetus in particular says to his students, that he seems to be saying, literally say these words to yourself. So we would describe those in cognitive therapy as coping statements. The specific sentences that people memorize and use in emotional or challenging situations. For example, Epictetus tells his students to say, this is nothing to me, in response to indifferent things or external things that they're becoming distressed by. Or to say, you are just an impression, as a distancing technique. Or it seemed so to him, in response to frustrations with other people. Obviously, those slogans have to mean something. They have to be part of a broader philosophy, but in the heat of a situation, the student falls back on a short, memorized statement. There's also the evening meditation, which I view as kind of related. Epictetus and Seneca both describe this process of, in the evening, reviewing all the things that you've done throughout the day and trying to learn from things, almost like you're being your own therapist for 5 minutes every evening, just reviewing your actions like you're your own coach. They derive that from the golden sayings of Pythagoras, which is a famous ancient, probably Neo-Pythagorean writing, but Seneca and Epictetus both appear influenced by it. Incidentally, even Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, wrote a book on Pythagoreanism, so that influence may go all the way back to the very origins of Stoicism. Writing aphorisms like Marcus does, trying to sum up ourselves, our ideas, our strategies very concisely and putting them down in writing. The whole of the meditations of Marcus Aurelius can be seen like that. I wonder sometimes whether the meditations of Marcus Aurelius was written immediately after and in response to the death of, perhaps by plague, of his main Stoic tutor, Junius Rusticus. And are these the actions of a man attempting to take over the role of mentor and become his own therapist, as we would say today, now that Rusticus is dead? And writing consolations, it took me a long time to realise that the Stoics did this for themselves. We have many consolation letters, particularly by Seneca, that are letters written to people typically who've been bereaved or having other problems, trying to persuade them to view things more philosophically and to deliver a kind of therapy by letter. But we're told also by Epictetus, I only noticed this a few months ago, that Epictetus actually tells us that a famous Stoic who was part of the opposition to Nero, called Pokorny Agrippinus, is one of Epictetus' role models and heroes, used to write consolation letters to himself. When something bad happened to him, he'd write himself a letter, trying to persuade himself to view it in a more constructive or positive way, to see it more philosophically. And then finally, there are a bunch of techniques that the Stoics have that relate to empathy. So I don't need to spend a lot of time on those because I summarised many of them at the beginning when I talked about Marcus Aurelius on anger. One of the main ones would be, again, this coping statement, it seemed so to him, or it seemed right to him. No man does evil knowingly. But Epictetus also says we should say to ourselves when we're frustrated with people, what aim does he have in mind? We should ask ourselves this question and try and put ourselves in the other person's shoes and empathise with them and understand what it is that they're assuming is most important in a situation, what their fundamental goal is. And by kind of penetrating into the mind of other people in that way, the Stoics think that we're likely to understand them better and become less frustrated with them. And then also we touched on this briefly right at the beginning of the quote from Marcus, the Stoic concept of oikeiosis, or identifying with other people, the brotherhood of man, or Stoic cosmopolitanism is a strategy that they have that helps them deal with frustrating relationships. Marcus talks in the Meditations about when someone frustrates him, imagining that they're like two rows of teeth working together. Even these people that are our enemies, as it were, that he's at war against perhaps, or betraying him at court in Rome, conspiring against him. He likes to view it as if they were prescribed to him almost by Zeus acting like a physician or a psychotherapist, sending them these things as lessons. Even though they seem to be working against him, he should actually be viewing it as a kind of a collaborative process, like partners in a dance or something like that. So there you go, a kind of lightning overview of Stoic techniques. I hope that wasn't too overwhelming. I'm going to have a quick look at the chat now and see some of the questions that you guys have been asking. I'll briefly see if I can answer some of those, and then we'll wrap up for today. And this is your chance just to add any other questions or comments that you might have thought of since I started talking. Sound and video are good, that's what I like to see. Good picture, good sound. Someone in Dartmouth, wow, hi. Not far. Someone in Aberdeen, wow, there you go. That's where I went to university. How can you apply Stoicism to combating panic attacks, anxiety disorders? Panic attacks are a tricky one. I'd suggest Stoicism could be relevant, but I have a hesitation about recommending Stoicism there because psychotherapy for panic attacks was notoriously ineffective until the mid-1980s. So sometimes people kind of flippantly say there's no progress in psychotherapy, and one example that really undermines that, blows that out of the water, is that panic attack treatment went from zero to hero. There's a guy called David Clarke in the UK, he's a well-known researcher in cognitive therapy. He developed a protocol that has like a 80-90% success rate in clinical trials. But prior to that, it was widely believed that panic attacks were kind of biological in origin and were untreatable. But what that tells us is that there are good ways and bad ways of treating them, and that the cognitive therapists have identified a particularly good strategy for treating panic attacks. So I would always say, if you're suffering from genuine panic attacks, diagnosable panic attacks, you should go and see a cognitive behavioural therapist, definitely. Anxiety disorders, Stoicism in general is extremely good at treating anxiety, and it can be integrated. It shouldn't be a substitute for CBT, but it can definitely complement CBT, and it can definitely help us with what therapists would call subclinical or non-diagnosable anxiety. Through the premeditatio malorum would be one of the techniques. Most of the techniques that I've just described actually would be relevant to the treatment of anxiety, but in particular that one, because the technique we know that works best is exposure therapy, actually in vivo or real world exposure, but also to a slightly lesser extent imaginal exposure, which is what we mean by negative visualization. What can we do to more accurately judge impressions? That's a broad question. The one thing that the Stoics ask us to do is wait until we've calmed down, our feelings have naturally abated, and then when we're feeling less emotional, give it in that space, evaluate our impressions, and in that space to begin by asking, is this about something that's up to me or something that's not directly up to me? Asking ourselves what Socrates or a sage would do, and asking ourselves what the consequences of going along with the impression would be. I hope that answers your question. I'm not sure if it's what you intended or not, but those actually are the strategies that Epictetus describes. What's your recommendation for the best books in Stoicism and CBT? Bit biased in this respect. There aren't many books on Stoicism and CBT. I recommend mine because I guess it's my kind of pet subject. So The Philosophy of CBT, the book that I held up earlier, is like, that's what it's about. This is my book, but it's the only book that particularly focuses on that niche area. And my self-help book, Stoicism and the Art of Happiness, happens to talk a lot about CBT as well. Negative visualization, I think it's something to me, because I will only attract negative things, then like it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Yeah, there's a tricky thing. I was told that it would only keep me in negative state of mind. What are your thoughts about negative visualization and the cadre of therapy and PTSD? Negative visualization, if it's done properly, should arguably resemble imaginal exposure, which is one of the main evidence-based interventions for PTSD. So I think the trick there is about really understanding the technique properly and how it would typically be done in evidence-based treatment protocols for PTSD. And a good CBT therapist that specialises in PTSD would be able to properly advise you about that. It will attract negative things. A cognitive therapist would often dispute that and ask you to carry out behavioural experiments to check. I mean, like, I'll give you an example. You wouldn't believe how many clients over the years I've asked to imagine that I'm going to break my leg. I've never broken my leg, but I've spent many therapy sessions asking clients to go away and write it down. Donald is going to break his leg, visualising me breaking my leg, to see whether that might, whether it's just magical thinking or not. And then they would move on to doing stuff about themselves as well, and really test out this hypothesis whether negative thinking can attract negative things. Basically, the assumption in cognitive therapy is it never does. Hi Donald, I understand certain Stoics practiced exercises like Pythagorean meditation. To what extent was a psychotherapy component common in Hellenistic philosophies? I probably talked about that earlier. It was really common. The medical metaphor was integral to Hellenistic philosophy, but most obviously to Stoicism, maybe to some extent to Cynicism, Epicureanism, but really to some extent to all Hellenistic schools of philosophy. Are some of the Stoic exercises we use learnt about in Stoic week older than Zeno and his contemporaries? That's hard to say because we don't know as much about the older schools of philosophy. We know a bit about Plato and Socrates, obviously, but not so much about the pre-Socratics. And some of what we know was written later anyway. Like about Pythagoras, a lot of it comes from Neo-Pythagoreans. We get onto kind of shakier ground in terms of the history there, but I would assume that there's nothing new under the sun and that most of these techniques were around in some form, and Zeno just kind of brought a lot of them together, maybe refined them. That's about what I've been typing. Oh, that's good. Donald, please make seminar announcements as you did on July 4th. Announcements via YouTube can be easily missed because Gmail filters it into the social section. We did announce this on Twitter and Facebook as well, though. Else it's just a pilot session. I'll make sure that I announce the other webinars that we're doing earlier in advance. What would you recommend to an aspiring Stoic in Venezuela? Do Stoic mindfulness and resilience training, which is coming up on the 16th. It's a perfect opportunity to get in touch with Stoics all around the world and collaborate with them, do the exercises at the same time as them, and read about their progress and how they're overcoming obstacles and their achievements and stuff. Okay, so 45 minutes, that's not too bad. I've only gone over by 15 minutes. I hope that answered most of your questions. And again, I'll, if you want to comment in the video afterwards when it goes up for replay, I'll have a look at those comments as well. If you want to share a link to this to people, they'll be able to watch the whole thing afterwards. So thanks everyone for coming along. Well, we've got a lot more people watching now, and I look forward to meeting some of you in the future. Will SMRT be available and teachable? Someone has asked. Yeah, it's already available and teachable. I should say you can enroll right now on SMRT, and it doesn't start until the 16th, but enrollment has opened, so you can go and enroll right now. I'll put the link up for that as well. Okay, so bye everyone. Thanks for coming along. It's goodbye from me and goodbye from Mookie Dog. I don't know if you can kind of see Mookie there in the background, snoozing in our chair. So goodbye from me, goodbye from Mookie in Nova Scotia. I look forward to meeting you again sometime in the future for another chat. Cheers then. Bye bye.